Exactly 1 year ago, Governor Kathy Hochul and corrections officers were closing in on a deal to end a 3-week illegal or wildcat strike at the state's prisons. But thousands of COs refused the deal and left their jobs. And since then, we've been paying the National Guard to staff prisons. And the results have been bad for the guards themselves, for taxpayers, for staff, and for people locked inside. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from the Wild Center in Tupper Lake, dedicated to strengthening visitors' connections to the natural world. More at wildcenter.org.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Monday, March 9th. First up, the North Star Health Alliance, which operates hospitals in Ogdensburg and Carthage, is currently undergoing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The group has laid off over 100 workers. Its CEO resigned in January. Now the relationship between North Star and a healthcare consulting group based in Maine has come under scrutiny after a recent court filing. Amy Feiereisel reports.
Since declaring bankruptcy on February 10th, the North Star Health Alliance has been making a lot of changes as it reorganizes both its debt and its leadership. Last week, the healthcare group installed a new interim CEO and laid off at least 3 other leadership team members. It also filed a motion with bankruptcy court to retain the services of an outside healthcare consulting group called Wintergreen. On its website, Wintergreen says it helps, quote, rural healthcare leaders do more with less. In its court filing, North Star argued that it required the services of Wintergreen as an experienced financial and restructuring advisor. It asked to be able to pay Wintergreen up to $240,000 per month. But Wintergreen has already been working for North Star for some time, at least a year, according to court documents. That's raising questions for a lot of people, says local Assemblyman Scott Gray. He told WWNY-TV he wants to know why North Star would keep paying Wintergreen for financial advice, since it didn't prevent North Star's bankruptcy.
You were there. You were doing this function. You're the one that brought them to the place they are right now. And all of a sudden, you're going to be a restructuring agent for them. It really doesn't make sense that the court is going through with this.
Bankruptcy court did approve North Star's arrangement with Wintergreen. North Star did not respond to NCPR's request for comment. Wintergreen declined to comment on, quote, specific projects or client engagements. But there's another piece of that agreement that raises questions about a potential conflict of interest. North Star's chief financial officer and chief restructuring officer as the group undergoes bankruptcy proceedings is Rob Bloom. Rob Bloom is also a principal at Wintergreen and has been since at least 2023, according to his LinkedIn profile. The agreement to employ Wintergreen as North Star restructures includes paying Bloom $450 per hour for his expertise. That's as the group has moved to lay off several other team leaders to save money. And North Star's financial situation is still on very shaky ground. Last Wednesday in U.S. bankruptcy court, attorney Charles Sullivan, representing Northern Credit Union, said the bank is extremely concerned about North Star's position.
The weeks ending March 6 and March 13 on the budget show positive balances, but, Your Honor, after that, the debtor falls off a cliff.
North Star's attorney Jeffrey Dove acknowledged that North Star did have a cash flow problem coming up soon, but that new CEO Andrew Manzer and chief restructuring officer Rob Bloom are working, quote, diligently to fix that. North Star will appear in bankruptcy court again this Wednesday, March 11th. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
The after effects of last year's prison strike continue to reverberate. Some incarcerated people have had their release dates delayed or even been denied parole because there isn't enough staffing to manage those programs. Rebecca McCrae reported on the strike and its impact for Hellgate, based in New York City, and for the Marshall Project and New York Focus. She spoke with Emily Russell.
Let's start with the strike. Officers were demanding safer working conditions and a solution to low staff levels. What were you hearing from incarcerated people while the prisons were on lockdown?
So during the lockdown, I was hearing from people in prisons throughout the state pretty much every day, and the problems they reported really varied in severity. I was hearing everything from programs were being canceled to insulin and other critical medications weren't being administered or were being administered late. Meals were being served late. In a few cases, meals weren't being served at all. And people were stuck in their cells for 24 hours a day at worst. Lawyers who had scheduled visits also were getting those visits canceled, and legal calls were getting canceled. And a lot of people couldn't reach their families by phone. So, and those last two really touch on a bigger theme that I just kept hearing, which was this, there was like a huge lack of information about what was actually happening throughout the system. And, over the course of the strike, 9 incarcerated people died, including Messiah Nantui, who was beaten to death by corrections officers. So that lack of information, coupled with that kind of information circulating throughout the system, was just provoking a lot of fear and anxiety for people inside.
So the strike ended when the union struck a deal with the state. Lockdowns were lifted. But life for a lot of incarcerated people didn't just go back to normal. Why has recovery been so slow behind bars?
So even though one agency runs the state's prison system, there are 42 different facilities throughout the state, and some of those were less affected by the strike. So maybe fewer corrections officers participated in the strike, or maybe more or fewer were fired from one place or another. The issues are really unevenly felt throughout the state. Prisons downstate, for example, were for the most part less affected. And even though thousands of National Guard members were deployed to support the staff, many of whom are still in prisons, they can't legally perform all the same duties of corrections officers. So still things just are not back to normal.
So staffing levels are as low today as they were before the strike. How has that impacted just the daily lives of incarcerated people?
I think one of the biggest issues impacting incarcerated people right now is limited family visits. So visitation is allowed fewer days a week than before the strike almost everywhere. And wait times for entering facilities are longer because people are all crammed into one day for visits, 1 or 2 days. And there are new screening procedures at some of the prisons as well. So for example, a guy at Attica I spoke to last week told me that after his family came up all the way from New York City to visit a couple times and then weren't even able to get in, he just told them to stop coming until the issue was resolved because he felt bad that they were waiting. So he hasn't seen his family in 8 or 9 months now.
You spoke with another man who's incarcerated at Franklin Correctional Facility in Malone and found that he was seriously impacted by the lack of programming. What did you hear from him?
Yeah, so John-Luc Papadopoulos is in kind of a tricky catch-22. He was recently denied early release by the parole board, in part because he hadn't completed substance use and anger management programs that are required. But the reason he hasn't participated in those programs is because they weren't running for the majority of time that he's been in prison. And even when they resumed, they only resumed part-time. And so as recently as last week, he's still on the wait list. And, there are a lot of other people in this position, from what I understand, who are just waiting and waiting for these programs that they are required to take, which means they ultimately might serve more time than they otherwise would have.
What has the State Department of Corrections said about all these impacts?
The prison agency definitely acknowledges that, the system is not operating normally and the recovery process is ongoing and that understaffing persists. But in the context of programming, public information officers have told me that no facility is operating without programs. And they say that college and substance use programs are running in the majority of prisons that offer them. That doesn't mean that programs are running the way they're supposed to. So, for example, someone I talked to recently who's incarcerated said that he used to take college classes 4 nights a week, and now they're only offered 2 times a week during the day. So he was looking forward to, finishing a degree, and now that's going to take much longer. And a lot of other folks are just waiting to even get into those programs.
That was freelance journalist Rebecca McCrae speaking with Emily Russell. You can find links to McCrae's prison reporting at our website, ncpr.org. We have more news there all the time, of course. Music today by Eddie Lawrence of Saranac Lake and Evan Veenstra of Gananoque, Ontario. I'm David Summers.